Welcome back to Uncovery. My name's Maddie, and this is a podcast about eating disorders, recovery, both my own and other people's. And today we are doing part two from last week's episode, which is called The Elephant in the Room. Part one was talking about how do we identify the elephant, which is an eating disorder that maybe somebody either isn't aware they have or isn't talking about having. And then, so once we've identified it, which was all of the content from last week, how do we approach somebody? How do we talk to somebody? And I think, procrastinated this episode for weeks. I believe this was very much at the top of my list and starting the podcast of topics that I needed to cover because it is the most frequently asked question. And also we did do a little bit of this. We touched on this in one of the Q&As because it was, again, a very frequently asked question. But to do a deep dive into it was really important to me because approaching someone is really important to people when they're thinking about eating disorders. And I get a lot of that. So I've been procrastinating it. And I couldn't figure out why I was getting so much anxiety about recording this episode. And I've identified that I think I've been putting it off and struggling with just like sitting down to either write it, research it, and think about it because I'm afraid of this episode being a disappointment. I'm afraid because there is not a good answer to this question. There's no one answer. There's no one approach. And I'm afraid that people will be disappointed. So that's why I think I've been procrastinating it. I was reflecting on this in a conversation with my mom the other day where you just don't know. You don't know how to approach someone. You don't know the best way to do this. There's no silver bullet on someone appears to have an eating disorder or I think I might have these symptoms and, how do we open up these discussions? But there are ways, and it really just comes down to here are a variety of things to talk about. Here are the best ways to approach this. And I realized there's actually a lot more do not do this than do this. Like there's no recipe for approach somebody who you think has an eating disorder and then they'll get help. But there are a whole bunch of please do not do these things if you think someone has an eating disorder. So with that said, there is this sort of step-by-step, what I would say is going to be the best bet if you're thinking about approaching somebody that you're worried about. Because if you see a loved one struggling with this stuff, it's devastating. I know this. I hear about this all of the time. And being on the other side of it, I think about this and I feel a lot of guilt a lot of the time about it because I know how uncomfortable it would make someone else that feels that they can't talk to me. Even now when I can be talked to about this at length, obviously, but how that would have impacted people when I was so secretive about it and hadn't identified that it was a problem yet and what this would be. And I think that's another part of the anxiety about being like, there's no right answer because depending on where you are in your eating disorder, you can have a very, very different feeling about somebody talking to you about it. So somebody talking to me about it now, or even last year or a few months ago or whatever, very different reaction than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because it would be so much more entrenched depending on where you are. So until someone's identified that they have a problem, it can really happen very differently, these conversations. And that I think, because I'm imagining myself in some of those other places that I was and how negatively I did react to being talked to about some of this stuff and how negatively I reacted at the prospect of that, how negatively I would have reacted at certain points. So all of that said, it takes a lot of bravery is the first thing that I want to say. So if a loved one is showing the signs of an eating disorder, and the next questions to kind of ask are whether or not this preoccupation is negatively impacting their life. And if you think about that, it takes a lot of bravery to ask because it's very, very uncomfortable. So I would say the number one thing is that it's never too early and it's never too late. And even when someone might be resistant or insisting that there isn't a problem, or you're not sure, you don't think someone is quote unquote sick enough, or like early intervention, err on the side of caution, this will reduce the length of time that they need to be in recovery, hopefully, right? The sooner you can kind of get ahead of it, I think the better outcome there will be. But of course, that said, the earlier you are in it, the less you think it's a problem, and you haven't reached that point as someone that has an eating disorder of, oh my God, I cannot take this anymore. I must recover. So it's a balance, and it's going to be a little bit of a crapshoot about where this person might be. The things that you would want to do to prepare for this conversation would be to inform yourself about eating disorders, inform yourselves about myths, especially as they pertain to, weight and shape, and thinking about the behaviors than the things that you've identified in this person. You don't want to be pointing at nothing when you just approach someone and tell them, like, I think you have an eating disorder. I think saying something that has more to do with the behaviors themselves and being specific about what it is that's worrying you is going to be much, much more impactful and effective. I would also say that choosing a time to approach somebody is really important. Do this privately. I think that might go without saying, but doing this in front of people, or like in a group setting, or like in a group meal, and kind of calling somebody out, intervention style almost, is very jarring and could lead to like a real backfiring effect. So context matters, and having somebody feel like they're in a safe space with you, I think will probably lead to a better outcome. Now, that said, when I first was approached successfully the first time by my parents, it was at a time that somewhat caught me off guard, but it was just individual. I just like happened to be at their house. I happened to be complaining about a physical symptom, and they kind of saw that as an entry point. So that said, if you see an entry point and it almost feels like, oh, here's a segue into this conversation, I would say capitalize on that as well. Okay, so the conversation itself, I think there's a few really important kind of steps. Explaining your concern, but without judgment. So what do you see? How does it feel? How can you imagine that they might be feeling? Be really honest. Tell them you love them, because you can say, look, I've noticed this when we sit down to a meal, or I've really noticed that you seem really anxious around food, or you seem a little bit like exhausted, tired, and I'm noticing these behavioral changes, things like that. And then follow that up with, it worries me because I love you and I hate to see you struggling. And for me, knowing, for example, when I knew that people at work were talking about it or noticing things, that was a game changer for me, because I was like, oh shit, this is not a secret to other people, and they're worried and it's coming up. Something that I would recommend is recognizing how exhausting it might be for them to say, look, this must be exhausting for you to go through alone if this is going on. That to me would break down a wall, I think, for them to really in that moment feel, shit, like this is exhausting, because it is exhausting, but we get so used to being in the disorder that it no longer feels exhausting. It feels normal. And so kind of calling that out and having that reflection of, man, actually, yeah, that is exhausting and it is so much work. And then once you've sort of put that out, asked the question, been concerned, then just stop. Listen, be patient. Understand that if they weren't expecting this conversation, they probably weren't. That's a lot for someone to process in a moment. So be patient, listen, give them some time to respond, and see then what they say. They might be really angry. They might be threatening in terms of the relationship that you have with them. So saying, if you bring this up again, I will not speak to you. That's tough. You're going to have to kind of swallow that on some level. And depending on how severe you think that this might be, then you'll have to think about sort of next steps, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it's really frustrating, and it can be really, really demotivating in that moment if somebody denies the problem. Now, there is a symptom of an eating disorder that is called anosognosia. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but it's the inability for someone to actually even recognize that they have an eating disorder. So they can't see it in themselves. So it might not be that they're outright denying it because they're trying to be secretive and they're trying to keep their eating disorder. It might actually be that they just don't know. And until I had reached a certain point, I definitely didn't think that I had an eating disorder. I don't even remember at what time I felt something flip and being like, this is probably a problem, because people really think that they're being healthy, that they're doing the right thing, and they're so in it that they might not even recognize it themselves. So it might not be about secrecy. It might actually be this lack of recognition. If you encounter this sort of denial or resistance or things like that, you can continue to show that you care. You can continue to show that this matters to you, but do not give in to the delusion. Do not give in to the lie that they don't have an eating disorder. Don't just say, oh, okay, I guess it's fine. Continue to present the reality that you're seeing, because hopefully then it might be able to chip away at the way that their insight is currently operating and helping them to get help. Let them know very clearly that you will be there every step of the way, that you will continue to check in, and that you're there if they ever want to talk about it. Because I just think that opening up this conversation is the only way for them to even begin to recognize that somebody is seeing something that maybe they aren't, or that there could be a better life, or that there could be something different. Now, whether or not they are super receptive, less receptive, a little receptive, not receptive at all, you have to encourage professional help. These are lethal mental illnesses, and you are not a trained professional. And so if they're not getting professional help, or at least seeing a physician, they're at higher risk. So you cannot DIY this. You need to outsource professional help for this. So suggesting that they speak to their doctor or a therapist or a dietitian that's registered, offer to either go to the appointment with them, to call somewhere for them, to get them some resources, or, calling one of the eating disorder helplines. Any of these things to sort of say, look, we can connect you in any place that feels the most comfortable as an entry point. But at the very least, I think that asking them to go to their doctor to be physically checked out, because sometimes if they would just listen to that professional or understand that the consequences of what they're doing could be quite harrowing, and hearing that from a professional, that might actually help. So I would say baseline, you need to physically be well. If it's outright denial and you're still really concerned, it's possible to gently approach another loved one of this person. If you're part of sort of their circle of either family or friends, it might feel very uncomfortable to do this, but if you're really concerned, this person might actually have the same concerns, and they very likely do. And they actually might have better insight too. So if there's somebody that's even closer to them, it could be that they are aware of it and that they are maybe taking care of it, and that the friend of yours actually just isn't telling you yet. Okay, so moving forward from there, whether or not this person is either open, going to get treatment, still resistant but exploring, whatever that is, then you essentially have to decide to what extent you need to create your own boundaries. I know how difficult it is to watch someone go through this, whether they are actively in recovery or they're resistant to it and they're still in denial. It's incredibly difficult. And that's why getting professionals involved and offloading some of the feeling of responsibility that you might feel for this person is so, so important, because you can't do it on your own. It will take a toll on you. And depending on what the extent of that feeling of that toll is, you may have to step away, and that's okay. And I want people to understand that you can't save someone. They can only do this for themselves. And you have to kind of recognize that. So if it comes the time where you're like, it is so detrimental, I can't do this. This can't be how I show up for this person right now. That's okay. If you decide to stay in this person and keep supporting them and be part of their life, and, more often than not, I think people generally, that's what they want. That's what they prefer. There's some things that you can kind of do as the go forward helpful things once you're going. So things like interacting outside of meals when you're socializing with this person. It can be really difficult to socialize when you're in recovery. Sometimes when so many things revolve around either meal times or meals out or whatever it is, and you're on a specific type of plan. And even if you're still like just quite disordered and you're not actually fully in recovery or anything like that, then as we've talked about before, this sort of anxiety around meal times can really come up. So doing activities that don't revolve around it can be helpful, or like don't revolve around exercise. It's tough to be like, oh, do you want to like go to a spin class? Like if you don't know if this person has like an exercise compulsion. So engaging in the conversation about being like, what helps us connect? What would you like to do? What is your schedule like? What are you open to? Because it might depend a lot depending on where they're at. Now, that said, offering to be part of sort of a meal support can be beneficial in certain ways. And it's a really tangible way to help somebody to support their eating. You can even offer to go grocery shopping together if they find that challenging, or to sit down with a meal out as part of something that maybe they're challenging. It's going to depend on where they're at. And so it's really just worth asking the question. I've utilized some kind of form of this, trying things like having my mom cook me a meal and sitting down and having it with her, or going out to a restaurant with my dad and, challenging that kind of fear, or even just having text message from a friend. So texting my friend and being like, hey, can you message me at like 6:30 to just like make sure that I'm doing the thing that I need to do? Because I think I'm going to need a little boost around that time. That kind of stuff can be really helpful. So asking them and, giving those kind of ideas is potentially something that you can kind of do to support them. I think the key there is really about asking them in what way it would be the most helpful. But that's sort of a go forward plan after you've had this conversation and you've been kind of brought into the circle of this person's challenge. Something else that you can do as a go forward is challenge the diet culture stuff yourself. So really changing your own perspective about food and exercise and bodies and things like that. If you're not already super familiar with that space, which most people I don't think actually are, I think I have a kind of a skewed view. I'm like, well, certainly everybody knows that diet culture is bullshit and food and nutrition and the things that they tell us are nonsense for the most part. And that obsession with exercise is actually super, super toxic and we need to stop focusing on bodies. There's still plenty of people in the world, it turns out, that do not have this new knowledge, do not have this perspective. Try to embody that yourself, really reflect on, am I part of this? Do I have these things? Is there something that maybe I can change? That's a really cool way to support someone that's going through eating disorder recovery, is to challenge those narratives. And not that you would have an eating disorder, but even just that you hadn't thought about the way that we talk about these things and kind of changing that. Now, don't underestimate your ability to help here. Just having this conversation, the elephant in the room, monumentally brave, monumentally important, potentially life-changing, potentially life-saving. It could be enormously helpful for you to show up in this way if you're feeling capable and driven to do so. And it's not easy, and you will often fail. This is why this episode was so hard to start and be like, why I was so anxious about doing it. Because I'm like, it is totally possible that this goes like ass sideways, not well. It's totally possible. There's no way to have this conversation perfectly. But you might actually just get it right. You might. And there's only one way to find out, really. Even if they're not fully ready to engage in treatment or ready to accept help or ready to invite that in, it is still worth more to have that conversation on the chance that you could help them. checking in periodically after that, helpful, right? Offer them hope that there is possibility for them to feel better, for them to not have to do this anymore. That in itself could be really, really great. Okay, before we go, there are some big don'ts. This is potentially more helpful than the what to do, because there's so many variations of what a conversation could look like, but there are some very, very clear, oh my God, please do not do this. The first one is, do not talk about appearance. Do not mention anything about this person's body. This will always, always, always trigger them to think about their body and the eating disorder, and it will make it worse. I guarantee. It does not matter if you are saying that they look better, if you are saying that they look healthy, if you are saying that they look well. Do not do it. There is no point, there is no benefit to saying that somebody looks well or looks healthy or looks better that is worth the risk that it triggers the eating disorder. Not helpful. What you can do instead is focus on feelings or good behaviors or things like that. Okay, try not to be accusatory or interrogating when you approach them. So you're allowed to feel frustrated, like you should feel frustrated. It is so valid. But rather than taking it out in that conversation, take it offline. Take it out with yourself. It's possible that burnout will happen if you're really, really involved in caring for someone or you're really, really close to them. So that's when you really need to check in with your own resourcing emotionally, and things like that. Try not to provide overly simplistic solutions. While it may seem obvious that this person simply needs to eat and exercise less or to stop throwing up or whatever it is absolutely not easy. It is very simple sounding, but it is not easy. So things like, oh, just go and eat a burger, or like, let's just like go eat a bunch of food, or, oh, this is something that I've heard before where people are like, oh my God, that's so exciting. You can just like go eat so much food and like, cause you're supposed to gain weight. And like, like I do not know how to explain to you that like, this is not exciting for me to be like, oh my God, you can just like freely go have a whole bunch of like high calorie food that other people wouldn't feel, comfortable eating. I'm like, that's the whole point. Like, it is absolutely not that simple, but thank you so much for that sentiment. Like, lucky me, I'm in recovery from an eating disorder. I understand it comes from a good place. I would not recommend saying that. And this one I did touch on before, but taking on the role of a therapist or kind of dominating either this conversation or further conversations around it, you don't have the answers. You don't have all of the tools that this person needs. You are a supporter. You are a friend. You are a family member. The eating disorder will always require professional intervention. Just period. End of sentence. There's going to need to be some outsourced help. So you don't need to be a therapist. You don't need to take that on. You just are there for the support that you're able to give. Okay. Those are the ways to have this conversation. And, I think as well, pointing to resources that exist, even like this podcast, for example, you're like, I was listening to this thing. It sort of brought up some stuff for me that I've been recognizing in you. And I really want to check in because this is really concerning to me. Like, that feels like a really decent segue. Or, reading something online, reading a resource and saying, hey, I was reading this. I came across this. I was looking into this because this is some of the stuff that I've been seeing. That kind of stuff, like pull in what you can to create your own segue into this conversation is potentially really helpful too. So that's a little like side advice. But yeah, best of luck as you sort of navigate these situations and these conversations. It will feel impossible, but it is not. And like I said, hold on to the fact that this conversation could save a life. That's how I feel about these podcast interviews or these episodes. I'm like, it could, maybe it won't, but it very, very much could, because these are very, very dangerous and lethal mental illnesses. And if we don't talk about them, if we do not identify and then directly address the elephant in the room, we're losing people. I hope this was helpful. Reach out with any further thoughts, things that you would recommend, not recommend, things that you have tried successfully or unsuccessfully. I think it's important to know what doesn't work as well as what does. And we will see you on the next episode.